I was standing at the window of the east corridor when my mother pressed the ring into the girl's palm, and I thought, she knows exactly what she is doing. She always did. My mother, Eleanor Vane, Dowager Duchess of Holvane, terror of 3 counties and the delight of every person she had ever truly loved, was dying. The physician had told us as much 5 days before. The physician was not wrong, and my mother, who had never in her life waited for permission to act, was using what time remained to arrange things to her satisfaction. I had watched her for 67 years, and I recognized the look. It was the same expression she wore when she redirected a river on the Holvane estate to save the lower pasture from flooding. The same expression when she outmaneuvered Lord Ashwick at the card table with 3 kings and a mendied sleeve. The same expression, most memorably, when she told my father, the late Duke, a formidable man in his own right, that he would be apologizing to the housekeeper before supper, and he did. The look that said, "I have seen the whole board and I know where this ends." The girl's name was Cecily Marsh. She had come to Holvane Park 14 months earlier, hired on as my mother's paid companion after my mother's eyesight began to fail, and the letters she loved to receive became harder to read. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a solicitor who had died in considerable debt, leaving Cecily with a modest education, a careful manner, a mind that the world had not yet thought to consult, and nothing else. No connections worth speaking of, no dowry, no family to call upon. She had arrived at Holvane Park in a gray traveling dress that had been mended twice at the cuffs and once along the collar, carrying a small leather case, and she had introduced herself to my mother with a curtsy so composed and unhurried that my mother had turned to me afterward and said under her breath, "There she is." I had not understood what she meant. I thought she was simply pleased to have found a capable companion. My mother did not correct me. She had the patience of a woman who knew she would eventually be proved right, and she saw no reason to rush the process. In the 14 months that followed, Cecily Marsh read aloud to my mother every morning: history, correspondence, the occasional novel, which my mother would declare tolerable if it was sufficiently sharp, and insufferable if it relied on coincidence in place of character. She walked with my mother in the garden when the light was good and the ground was dry enough. She organized my mother's correspondence with a quiet efficiency that put the house steward to mild but justified embarrassment. She never talked too much and never too little. She had, as far as I could observe, no interest in performing goodness for an audience. She simply did the work and did it well, and she was kind to my mother in the way that tells the truth about a person, not the kindness that arrives when someone is watching, but the smaller kind. The extra shawl laid across the chair before the chill came in from the window. The passage rearied without being asked because my mother had drifted into thought and lost the thread. The window latched just so, at exactly the angle that kept the draft out without cutting off the morning air my mother liked. My mother was not a woman easily touched. She had lived a long life in the company of people who wanted something from her, and she had developed a reliable instinct for the difference between affection and performance. She loved Cecily Marsh within 3 months, and said so to me plainly, which, for my mother, was less a confession than a statement of observed fact. My brother Richard noticed none of it. Richard, the Duke of Holvane, 11 years my senior, the most rigidly correct man I have ever known in a long life of knowing correct men, noticed very little that was not written in a letter of account or placed directly in his path. He was not a cruel man. He was, as my mother once said with the affectionate sorrow of a woman who knows her child completely, a man who had organized his heart so thoroughly that he could no longer find it without a map. He had been married once to a woman of impeccable connections who had died in childbed along with the child, and he had sealed that part of himself as methodically as he sealed everything else. The estate was run. His duties were discharged. He was respected across the county and feared a little by those who did not know him, and left largely alone by those who did. He spoke to Cecily Marsh perhaps a dozen times in 14 months. Courteous, brief exchanges on matters of household business. He would have been surprised, I think, if asked to describe what she looked like beyond brown hair, quiet, wears gray. My mother noticed that too. My mother noticed everything. She summoned Richard on the 4th day of her dying. I was already in the room. I had not left her side except to sleep, and even that I begrudged, and Cecily was seated near the window in the afternoon light, reading aloud from a collection of letters my mother had received over 30 years from an old friend in the north. When Richard came in, my mother lifted one hand, barely, and Cecily closed the book on her thumb to keep the place and sat with her hands in her lap and waited. That was her manner exactly, always ready to stop and always ready to resume, as if the interruption were of no consequence whatever. My mother looked at Richard for a long time. He stood by the door with the correct, careful expression of a man prepared to receive difficult news and absorb it without visible disruption. "Sit down, my darling," she said. He sat. He was 50 years old, and she called him, "My darling," and he received it the way a man receives water after a long march, with a relief too deep to acknowledge aloud. "I am going to ask something of you," my mother said. Her voice, even then, even reduced to what illness makes of voices, held its characteristic directness. "I am going to ask it only once, and I am going to name it plainly, because I am very tired and I have no patience left for the kind of conversation where the true subject is everyone's mind, but no one's mouth." Richard said, "Ask it." My mother turned her head on the pillow and looked at Cecily. "I want you to marry Miss Marsh," she said. The candle on the table between them did not even shift. The room was perfectly still. I kept my eyes on Richard's face because I could not look away from it. His expression did not change. That was the extraordinary thing, not a flicker of the outrage, the alarm, the aristocratic affront I would have expected. He looked at my mother, and then he looked at Cecily, who had gone absolutely motionless, her hands pressed flat together in her lap now, her eyes lowered to the rug, and then he looked back at my mother, and his face was composed and closed and utterly unreadable in the way that told me he was working very hard to keep it that way. "No," he said. My mother nodded once, as if he had confirmed something she had already written down. "I thought you would say that. She is a paid companion with no family and no name. The idea is—" "The idea," my mother said, with a patience so absolute it was almost severity, "is that she is the finest person I have encountered in the last 20 years. She has read to me every morning for 14 months without complaint, without flattery, without a single attempt to make herself more appealing in my eyes than she was the day she arrived. She has been kind to me in ways she thought no one would observe, which is the only kindness that tells the truth about a person. She sat with me 3 nights ago from midnight until the light came, holding my hand, because I could not sleep and could not bear to ring for anyone, and she knew it without being told." Richard's jaw moved slightly. He said nothing. "I have lived 67 years, my mother said. I have known a great many people. I know what this girl is, Richard. I know it the way I knew your father before anyone else saw it, before his family saw it, before the county saw it. I saw it in a garden in June, and I never doubted it afterward." She stopped to breathe for a moment, and the effort it cost her was visible, and we both watched and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Then she continued, "I am not asking you to love her today. I am not so romantic as that. I am asking you to give her the protection of your name, a proper settlement, and time enough to see what I see. That is all." "Mother," he said, "this is not—" "I know what it is not," she said. "I am asking anyway." She reached beneath the coverlet with a hand that trembled slightly, the first trembling I had seen from her, and it lodged in my chest like a coal and produced a ring. A small, plain thing. A single pale stone in a silver setting, not one of the grand Holvane pieces, not a family ring at all. Something she had chosen herself, I understood at once, for this purpose, at some earlier point when she had been well enough to choose. She held it towards Cecily. Richard made no move to take it. "He will come to it," my mother said, which was neither a prediction nor exactly a reassurance, but something more certain than either. She pressed the ring into Cecily's palm and held both her hands around the girl's and said something, 2 or 3 words, too low for me to hear from where I stood. Cecily's eyes were very bright. She did not look at Richard. Richard stood. He straightened his coat with the small, precise tug he always gave it before leaving a room. He said, "I cannot agree to this," and then with a different register lower, "I am sorry, Mother." He crossed to the door. He did not slam it. He pulled it shut behind him with the careful, controlled click of a man for whom slamming would be an admission of feeling, and the controlled click was, somehow, louder. My mother lay back against her pillow. She looked at me, and one corner of her mouth turned, the way it did when she had just played a card she was confident about. "Give him a week," she said. In the days between that conversation and my mother's death, I watched Cecily Marsh more carefully than I ever had. I had always been fond of her in the vague, unconsidered way one is fond of anyone who does their work well and causes no trouble. But I looked at her now with something more like attention. She did not behave differently after my mother's request. She did not try to catch Richard's eye at dinner. He was not at dinner. He ate in his study those days. She did not linger in rooms where he might pass through. She did not adjust her manner in any direction to account for what my mother had said or what he had refused. She simply continued to do what she had always done. Read to my mother in the mornings, organize the letters, sit with the household accounts when Mrs. Poole needed a second pair of eyes, walk in the garden in the afternoon, and return with the particular knowledge of what was in flour and what was coming and what the kitchen might want for the table. What my mother had seen in her, and what I saw watching more carefully now, was not cleverness in the showy sense, not beauty that commanded a room, not accomplishment deployed for effect. It was something quieter and harder to name, a kind of solidity. She was simply entirely herself, whether or not anyone was watching, and the self she was happened to be good. That was the whole of it. And it was, I thought, the rarest thing in the world my mother and I moved through, where nearly everyone was something slightly different depending on the size of the audience. Richard, behind his careful exterior, was the same way. He had always been. He was good, genuinely, below the cold management and the organized grief. My mother had seen that in him when he was a boy, before the world had taught him to seal it over. She had been trying, I think, for 20 years to find the right person to unseal it again. She had found her in a gray traveling dress with twice-mended cuffs, and she had been patient, and she had arranged it, and now she was dying, and the only question was whether Richard would be foolish enough to refuse the gift. She died on Tuesday morning, 3 days later, in the hour when the light through the east windows was the color of old honey, and the house had not yet woken. Cecily sat with her the whole of the night before. I know because I relieved her at dawn for an hour and found her already back when I returned, seated in the chair with a candle and the book, reading aloud in barely more than a whisper. I asked her once if my mother could still hear, and Cecily said she didn't know, but she thought the words might reach her anyway. I thought of that afterward many times, the care of it, the refusal to stop doing a kind thing simply because the outcome was uncertain. Richard, when it was over, did what he always did when feeling threatened to overwhelm his defenses. He worked. The funeral arrangements, the letters to be sent, the legal obligations, the estate accounts that never waited for grief. He was in his study from before dawn until well past midnight. He ate very little. He spoke to me briefly and to the household staff with his customary brisk courtesy, and to Cecily Marsh not at all. He also, I learned from Mrs. Poole, sent a letter to his solicitor. Cecily packed her things 11 days after the funeral. She said nothing to me about the ring or my mother's request. She did not seek an audience with Richard. She did not make her going a scene or a protest or anything that required someone else to respond to it. She said her farewells to the household in the quiet, thorough way she did everything. A word to Mrs. Poole, a note to the head gardener, who had let her cut herbs from the kitchen garden, and who had given her a cutting of a climbing rose she had once admired along the garden wall, a long-stemmed thing with pale pink flowers, which had been blooming when she arrived, and which had finished its season weeks before she had thought she would be leaving. She packed the cutting in a damp handkerchief and put it carefully in her case. I found her in the corridor outside the library on a Wednesday afternoon with the case at her feet and her gray traveling dress on. "Where are you going?" I said, though I knew. "Yorkshire," she said. "A family called Harwick in the North Riding. 2 daughters who need a companion for the season. Richard's solicitor arranged it." She met my eyes without flinching. "I believe the Duke requested that appropriate placement be found. Mr. Aldwick was very efficient. He had not even done it himself. He had given the task to a solicitor as if she were a piece of furniture to be moved." "Cecily," I said, and then could not find the rest of it. She looked at me with the composure that was so entirely hers, not cold, not hardened, simply the look of a woman who has long been accustomed to managing her own circumstances and has not expected anyone else to manage them for her. "Your mother was the kindest person I have ever known," she said. "I hope you understand what a rare thing she was. I hope you will tell the Duke that I am grateful for the position he has found and that I wish him well. Truly." She lifted her case. She walked toward the front stairs with the same unhurried step she had always had, as if whatever came next was simply the next thing, and she was ready for it. I did not go after her. I went to my brother's study, and I opened the door without knocking, which I had been doing since I was 8 years old, and which had never once succeeded in making Richard look genuinely surprised. He looked up from a letter with the expression of a man who has already decided not to be disrupted. "She is leaving," I said. "I know." I took the chair across from him without being invited, and I sat in it, and I did not speak for a moment, because I was choosing my words with more care than I usually troubled myself with. Richard was not a man you could reach through sentiment alone. He had too much practice deflecting it. You needed something harder, something specific. "Do you remember what Mother said to you about kindness?" I said. He did not answer. "The kindness that shows itself when no one is watching," I said. "She said that to you. In that room 5 days before she died, she said it to you directly, and she was describing that girl, and you heard it, and now you have sent her to Yorkshire through a letter to your solicitor." I paused. "You could not even do it yourself. You handed the business to Aldwych." "Edmund." She packed a cutting of a climbing rose in a handkerchief. I let that sit between us a moment. "The head gardener gave it to her from the garden wall. She admired it when she first came here, and now she is carrying a piece of it to Yorkshire to plant in a stranger's garden, because she has been given nowhere of her own to put it." I looked at him steadily. "That is the woman you have decided to let walk down the front drive." Richard had put the letter down. His hands were flat on the desk. "Mother was not wrong about people," I said. "In 67 years, she was not wrong once about the character of someone she loved, and she loved Cecily Marsh within 3 months of meeting her and never once changed her mind. She was not wrong about you either. She said you would come to it. She gave you a week." I looked at him. "She has been in the ground for 11 days, Richard." Through the window behind him, I could see the gravel of the front drive and the corner of the carriage waiting there. Richard's face was entirely still and entirely closed, which was the expression he wore when he was thinking very loudly and did not intend to allow any of it to be seen. I had known him 50 years. I could read it anyway. I stood up. "She said to tell you she is grateful and she wishes you well." Those were her exact words. A woman who has nothing, who is going to Yorkshire to be a paid companion to strangers she has never met, sends the Duke of Holvane her warmest wishes. I straightened my coat. "I am going to pour myself a glass of Mother's port. You may do as you like." I left him. I did not go to the port. I went back to the east corridor and stood at the window, the same window, where I had been standing when all of this began. The carriage was at the door. The driver was up on the box. Cecily came down the front steps, small, straight-backed, her chin level, her case in her hand. She crossed the gravel at her own pace because she had always moved at her own pace, and she reached the carriage door and the footman made to open it. Then I heard the study door. Boots on stone. The front door, which had a particular sound it made when it was pulled open quickly. And then my brother's voice, across the gravel, not loud but perfectly clear. The way a man's voice is clear when he has decided something and is no longer trying to contain it. "Miss Marsh." She stopped, she turned. Richard came down the front steps without his greatcoat, which was the sort of lapse in Richard's person that I would not have predicted in 30 years of knowing him. He crossed the gravel and stopped in front of her, and the footman retreated with a discretion born of long service, and the driver on the box found something extremely interesting to examine in the near distance. Richard looked at Cecily and Cecily looked at Richard, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Richard said, "I have been an extraordinary fool." Cecily said nothing. She was very good at nothing. "My mother was not wrong," he said. "She was not wrong, and I knew it, and I sent you to Yorkshire through a letter to my solicitor because I was afraid. That is the honest account of it, not propriety, not the question of your name or your connections. Fear." He stopped. Let the words stand there between them. "I am not accustomed to naming that." "I noticed," Cecily said quietly. Something moved in his face, a flicker of something that was very nearly surprised, and then faintly, unmistakably, something that was very nearly a smile. I thought, that is what my mother saw, that exact thing, the way she could reach him without trying. He put his hand in his coat pocket and produced the ring, the small ring, the plain one. He was holding it in his open palm, and he said, "You returned this before you packed." "It was not mine to keep," she said. "Your mother gave it to me in front of you and you refused, so it seemed only right to leave it." "I was wrong to refuse," he said. "I would like you to take it back." He looked at her with the directness that was, in Richard, as close as he could come to vulnerability. "Not as an obligation, not as the fulfillment of something my mother arranged, though she did arrange it, and I will not pretend she did not, because she was almost certainly planning it for a year before she said a word, but as a request, a genuine one. He steadied himself, which for Richard looked like the barely perceptible squaring of shoulders. I watched you in that room with her. I was not always visible to you, but I was there more than you know. I saw what you did, not the formal duties, the other things. The things that no one asked you to do and no one would have noticed if you had not done them. The window at exactly the right angle, the passage reread, the 3 hours in the night. He paused. She told me that was the only kindness that told the truth about a person, and I did not listen, and then she died, and I have thought about very little else for 11 days. Cecily was entirely still. I would like you to stay at Holvane, he said. I would like to give you reason to stay that is better than the one you were given when you arrived. I would like— He stopped again, looked briefly at the ring in his palm, and then back at her. I would like to know where you intended to plant the rose cutting. Cecily looked at him for a moment, and I saw the thing that my mother had seen, the thing that had made my mother press a ring into her palm and say, too low to hear, he will come. I saw Cecily Marsh decide quietly, without drama or condition, to believe him. I had not yet decided, she said. I thought I would know the place when I saw it. There is a south wall, he said. Old stone, faces the sun most of the day. Nothing has grown on it in 20 years. I think— He paused. I think my wife and I had intended to put something there, and then we did not, and after that I could not think of it without, in any case. It has been bare for 20 years. I would like to see something growing on it. Cecily looked at him for a long moment. The morning light came in at a low angle across the gravel and touched the pale stone in the ring, and it was small and plain, and had never belonged to any prior history at Holvane, which was exactly what my mother had intended. A ring with no claim on the past. You would need to ask me properly, she said. Richard, who was the Duke of Holvane, who had not asked for anything in 20 years that he was not already certain of receiving, looked at her, and took her hand in both of his, and held it with a care that told more than a speech would have, and said, Cecily Marsh, will you stay? Will you give me the time my mother asked you to give, and allow me to try to be worth it? Cecily was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she turned her hand over in his and closed her fingers around the ring and said, Yes. He let out a breath, a barely audible thing, the sound of a man setting down something he has been carrying too long. He slid the ring onto her finger and he held her hand, and neither of them spoke, and the driver on the box continued to study the middle distance with great dedication. I watched from the east corridor window and thought of my mother and her clear eyes and her absolute composure, and I said silently to no one, You were right. She always was. The solicitor received a letter that afternoon canceling the Yorkshire arrangement. It was written in Richard's hand with the contained efficiency of a man who has resolved something and intends to move forward without further comment. Mrs. Poole, who had run the Holvane household for 31 years and who did not often express surprise, told the cook that evening that she had not expected it. Then, after a pause of perhaps 10 seconds, she amended this to say that she supposed, if she examined the matter, that she had always rather expected it, because the Dowager Duchess had not done anything without a reason in the whole 31 years of her acquaintance. The banns were read the following month. There was no announcement fashioned for the county, no dinner or assembly arranged to display the match to an audience. Richard did not go in for display. He informed his solicitor, his man of business, the estate tenants, and me, over breakfast. With the same brisk certainty he applied to all decisions he had already made, and left the world to make of it what it liked. I attended the wedding in the small chapel on the Holvane grounds on a morning in early spring, when the light was thin and clean, and the air still had the cold edge of the season turning. Cecily wore a gown the color of new cream and her dark hair simply dressed, and she carried no flowers because the garden had not yet come fully into itself, and she arrived at the chapel without a family to walk beside her, which would have been a sorrow at any other wedding, and at this one somehow was not, because the chapel was small and the only people in it were the ones who meant it. Richard held her hands through the ceremony. He kept his eyes on her face the entire time. I had known him for 50 years, and I had never seen him look at anything with such uncomplicated attention. Not a letter of business, not a map of the estate, not the horizon from the high ridge above the North Fields, which he had always loved. He looked at Cecily the way a man looks at a thing he nearly failed to see in time. When the vows were said and the vicar had finished, we stepped out into the thin spring morning, and Richard kept Cecily's hand, which was not in his nature. He was not, by training or temperament, a man who held hands in public or in private. He kept hers as if releasing it was no longer something he intended to do. I walked with them a little way and then fell back, because some things are meant for two, and my mother had taught me to know the difference. That afternoon Cecily planted the climbing rose on the south wall. She wore her old gray dress for it, and she was on her knees in the turned earth with her sleeves rolled past the cuffs, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, and Richard stood beside her holding her shawl and looking down at her with the expression of a man who has, after a long absence, found his way back to something he had not known he was trying to reach. He did not look even slightly like a duke. He looked, instead, like a man who is prepared to stand in a garden holding a shawl for the remainder of the afternoon, and considers this a good use of his time. I poured a glass of my mother's best port, which she had always saved for days that had earned it, and I raised it in the direction of the east windows of the house, where she had stood so many times and where she would not stand again, and I said quietly, "You were right, as usual." The rose took to the wall as if it had been waiting for exactly that stretch of old stone and no other. By the following summer it had spread the length of it, and by the summer after that it was 12 feet high, and the flowers on it were the color of the first light of a good day, and visitors who asked about it were told that the Duchess had brought it and planted it herself. Which was true in every way that mattered. She had carried it from nowhere, wrapped in a handkerchief, and she had known before anyone asked where it would grow, and she had been right, as she was about most things, and about the people she loved without exception.